Hello, Zero Books viewers. Welcome to Theorizing with a Hammer with C. Derick Varn. And today, this will complete our multi-part discussion on the nature of class by returning to Marx. So we've gone through Bourdieu, we've gone through Weber, we've talked about E.O. Wright's attempt of synthesis of Marxian, Weberian, Berdurian, and liberal economics, and we'll come back to that. But there's been a lot of comments in various videos asking me to go into what is false consciousness and what is class consciousness, and is it just fooling people? Can you explain it? And I'm going to attempt to explain it by explaining something else, and we're going to have to do a little bit of intellectual genealogy to really parse the way the words are used here and what they mean. And then I'm going to tie it back into this multi-layered kind of multi-framework approach to class that we've been kind of talking about this entire time. So to understand class consciousness and false consciousness as a concept, we need to contextualize the way Marx actually spoke about this. And Marx rarely, very rarely, used the phrase class consciousness. And at no time did he use the phrase false consciousness. What he talked about was the distinction of class in itself and class for itself. Now, the in itself and for itself distinction is actually used more prevalently in phenomenology and existentialism. And that particular phrasing does come out of German idealism, and particularly Kant and Hegel, who disagree with each other. And now I'm going to detour us a little bit with a history of philosophy, and also how Marx cannot define class and yet insist on such a distinction, because that also is something you have to deal with, and that is somewhat methodological. So, it all begins in ancient Greece. And in ancient Greece, and in most ancient forms of philosophy, in Chinese philosophy, in the school of the logicians in the 100 Schools period, and in Abhidharmic and Yogacara philosophy in the Indian and Indo-Tibetan Buddhist tradition, there was also traditions of dialectics. Now, what was dialectics before Hegel and before German idealism? Dialectics was one of the modalities or kinds of argument. So the first kind of argument was, axiomatic or logical. And it worked like geometry. You stated your principles, and from your principles you had proofs. You didn't try to prove your axioms, right? They're just taken as given. But when you can't agree on what an axiom is, and it's not tautological, meaning it's not just a definition that you give so something has a definition, like a lamp is something that gives light. Why? Because that's what we call a lamp. You have to argue about that. And so dialectics is the dialogical means of doing that, where you're actually debating in order to arrive at the definition in the first place. Now, I'm going to skip 1,500 years of Western philosophy and say that by the time you got to the 1800s, you started to see a historicizing of philosophy. That trend also shows up in Nietzsche's concept of genealogy. It shows up in evolutionary theory and British thought, but it is really encapsulated by Hegel's expansion of this dialectics as it existed in argument to an argument that emerges in history, in the movement of history itself. All right. that is where Hegel really defines what dialectics is in a way that leads to Marx, as opposed to just arguing to arrive at a definition. Instead, history itself is seen as an outplaying of an argument where the pure idea manifests. Now, what that pure idea is probably God, as expressed in negative form, but it's a little unclear in Hegel, to say the least. It's something that scholars can debate about. And in fact, which translation of Hegel you read actually is going to pick a side in this debate, because often a lot of Hegel's Swabian dialect, precise German, is going to be read either religiously or logically, and it's kind of a pun almost in the original, or at least both meanings can be implied, whereas when you translate them into English, you have to pick one or the other often. But that's a thing for another time. Now, Hegel's dialectics is something Marx saw as vitally important, but another thing that Marx was pulling from was Hegel's phenomenology. But to get to that, we have to deal with a problem that came up in Immanuel Kant. And that is phenomena versus noumena, are appearances versus the thing in itself. Now, in Kant, the thing in itself cannot be known between two individuals. Right? There's a hard break. But we can know the appearances of a thing. Hegel approaches this differently and kind of says that's sort of irrelevant. We can know the substances are what is objective. So the substance is what is logically necessary or what is physically apparent. It's the object in space. And then by negating or differentiating ourselves from another substance, we create our own subjectivity. So subjectivity comes from realizing that we are not that other thing that may act like us. And in realizing that that thing acts like us but isn't us, we also realize ourselves. So that is the subject. Now, the subject-object distinction is important even in the way we construct language. The language is a subject if it can act, if it has agency, if it has the freedom to move. Otherwise, it is acted upon, in which case it is rendered an object, or it is objectified, or it is treated as if it is an object, even if it does have agency. This background, coming from Kant's phenomena noumena distinction, getting into Hegel's substance versus subjectivity, which is related to the subject-object distinction, leads us to class as an objective force and class acting for its own accord. So you can see class as a material and sociological reality, a category which exists because of the way the economy is structured for Marx, and you can see it acting for itself for its own freedom, becoming thus a subject, and Marx, in Marxist jargon, a subject of the historical epoch, a subject of the mode of production, or in shorthand, a subject of history. Now, what is the difference between the class in itself and object self? Well, if the class doesn't recognize itself as a collective agent, it's not a class for itself. It cannot be free because it doesn't recognize its own existence and thus can't have agency. You'll notice, though, if you know modern European philosophy, that you're probably more used to hearing this in the Husserl, Heidegger, Sartre being in itself and being for itself. Being in itself, it being sort of like mere existence, and being for itself being freedom, the ability to be free. And that is actually a pretty good understanding of the distinction. And Husserl is actually pulling, in some way, responding to the substance, the same substance subjectivity distinction that Marx is pulling from. And in some ways, it's a good parallel for understanding this. In Marx, the class that realizes it is a class first has to realize its objective conditions, and then by realizing its objective conditions can act in a way that can change the relationships that impose those objective conditions in the first place. Thus, it can move from a passive agent that exists because of the structure of the economic life that we live in to an active agent that can change the political economy itself. But there's some big buts in here. You will notice that a class must be conscious of its position across the board to be a class. And I'm going to read Nikolai Bukharin on this from Historical Materialism, A System of Sociology, Chapter 8, to kind of go into this, because I have a lot of problems with that chapter in particular. But this explanation of what Marx is doing is actually one of the clearest I've read. But the first thing you need to know is a lot of people tell you Marx doesn't ever define class. While in the Communist Catechism written by Engels, there was a definition of proletariat, and there was kind of a definition of working class. Marx took a lot of that out in collaboration with Engels into making the Communist Manifesto, and he took it out because of a principle early Marx was claimed to have lived by. He said he would never write a sentence that you couldn't prove at least 10 ways. In an axiomatic definition, as we just talked about in analytic philosophy, right? Going all the way back to, predicate logic from Aristotle, can't be proven. It is just assumed. So Marx isn't going to want to write that way. He isn't going to define the terms. He's going to want to go through the historical argument, as a good post-Hegelian. He's trying to develop past Hegel, right? But he thinks Hegel's interjection of history into this philosophical process is really clarifying on how you figure out what a class is. How does it emerge over time? So, Marx doesn't define class, he describes it. And he describes it in many places in the in the philosophical and economic manuscripts of 1844, in the kind of brief sketch he gives in the Manifesto, but most specifically in the Grundrisse, in the Totality of Capitals, Volume 1 through 3, and in Theories of Surplus Value. If you read all those together, you kind of get a description of how the classes work. But if you even go back to the Communist Manifesto, Marx sees that, yes, there might be multiple classes in a society, but classes are really defined between the antagonism of two of them. And as history progresses, those antagonisms get clearer, and you get things that are more clearly called modes of production. We'll list off many of them. And this is where the Bukharin synthesis of this is going to be really useful, and I'm going to read it to you now. We have already seen the important function of classes in the evolution of human society. Even the social structure in class society depends chiefly on what classes exist in this society, what is their mutual relation, etc. And we have seen that great alteration in social life is connected with class struggle in one way or another. It is not unimportant to note that the transition from one form of society to another is realized through the furious class struggle. This is why Marx and Engels opened up their Communist Manifesto with the words, "The history of society existing up to the present moment is a history of class struggles." We have to already define the general nature of a class. Now we need to go into this in further detail. A social class, as we have seen, is an aggregate of persons playing the same part in production, standing in the same relation towards other persons in the productive process. These relations being also expressed in things, the instruments of their labor. It follows that in the process of distribution, the common element of each class is its uniform source of income, for the conditions in the distribution of products are determined by the conditions in production. Textile workers and metal workers are not two separate classes, but a single class, since they bear the same relation to certain kinds of other persons, engineers, capitalists. Similarly, the proprietors of a mine, a brick field, a coarse factory, are all of one class. For regardless of the physical differences between the things they manufacture, they occupy a common, commanding position with regard to the persons engaged in the process of production, which is also expressed in things, i.e., capital. The production relations are therefore at the basis of class alignment in society. Other divisions have been made, which must now be disposed of. A frequent conception of the division is into rich or poor. A man having twice as much money in his pocket as another is considered as belonging to a different class. The basis of this division is the case of the amount possessed of the standard of living. This conception is not only very simple, but is also naive and erroneous. From this point of view, a well-paid metal worker in a capitalist society would not be counted with the proletariat, while a poor person or an artisan would fall into the working class. The lumpen proletariat would have to be considered as the most revolutionary class, as the power capable of realizing the transition to the higher form of society. On the other hand, two bankers, one of which had twice as much money as the other, would have to be assigned to two separate classes. Yet everyday experience shows us that the various classes of workers are far more likely to fight side by side than workers and artisans and workers and peasants, etc. The peasant is not much inclined to feel any solidarity with the worker, and at the under end of the scale, the two bankers feel themselves to be the member of the same family, though one be 10 times richer than the other. Marx has already pointed out the size of one's purse constitutes merely a quantitative difference, which may be, to sure, though two individuals of the same class in violent opposition to each other. But in other words, the difference in wealth may not be considered a sufficient basis for a definition of class, even though it has an influence in the frame of one's class. As a side note, I'm not reading Bakar now, I'm speaking for myself. You'll notice this rhymes with what we talked about with the experience of class. With the experience of class. So, Bakarin says, based off Marx, that while it's important and affects our experience how different we might be distributed income, our role is what defines class. And class consciousness comes from realizing our means of turning the class in itself, the sociological existence of this relationship, to the class for itself, something it can advocate for its own self-interest as a class as a whole, not just for your immediate interest or your sectional interest or your own ideology. Now, to really understand this, we have to go back to false consciousness. False consciousness is a term used to describe the material, ideological, and institutional processes that are said to keep the proletariat from realizing the revolutionary potential in a capitalist society. Consciousness, and in this context, reflects the class's ability to identify and assert a trail, i.e., become a subjective agent. Now, Marx never used this phraseology, but Engels did. In fact, Engels seems to have coined the term in a 1893 letter to Franz Mehring to address the scenario where the subordinate classes really embodied the ideology of the ruling class. Engels was trying to explain why there might be people in the working class who believed in ruling class ideology. There's been several different attempts to work this out. Lenin and even in Bakarin and the thing I read start talking about this. They use this way more than even Engels did. As the 1930s started to roll around, you started seeing Gramsci try to explain this in the idea of cultural hegemony. You saw the structuralist, particularly the Marxist structuralist Louis Althusser, talk about interpolations of false consciousness onto people through ideological state apparatuses, which I don't myself think is the most cogent explanation. And you saw all kinds of people talk about false consciousness, such as Adorno and Marcuse, the Situationist movement, the Maoist Third World movement, who talked about labor aristocracy instituting a false consciousness. You've seen it in psychoanalytic writers. But what false consciousness is a block to class consciousness. And class consciousness is really defined in History and Class Consciousness by George Lukács in 1923. And class consciousness then is this idea of becoming a conscious subject. So you can see how this relates to both the Sartrean being in itself, mere being, and being for itself, being that has freedom to move and has agency, and to the substance subjectivity or subject object distinction and German idealism. And what Marx is trying to say is there's a materialist reason for this in class. Now, all that complicatedness aside, I'm going to return to what I was talking about with E.O. Wright. E.O. Wright, in his second to last book, Understanding Class, tried to overlay the Weberian framework on the Marxist one, and he noticed that in the Weberian framework, Max Weber had also discovered that class was an objective relationship intrinsically, but was not intrinsically a collective agent, meaning it could not act, or it did not intrinsically act politically, but that it could be a collective agent if it was aware of itself to become so. So, for example, a nation is necessarily a collective agent because it is literally structured to be. It has a government which is supposed to represent its citizens in some kind of collective mediated way. All right, whether that is through the divine will of the king who is sovereign, or whether it's through the collective sovereignty of a ruler who represents the people's will, either through democratic imperative or through some other kind of imperative. It is necessarily a collective agent, but a class does not have to be, but can be. And if you look at that, then from this framework that E.O. Wright's talking about, the division between the class which does not realize it can be a collective agent and the class that is a collective agent is the difference between the class in itself and the class for itself, and the class being able to be a political actor as opposed to just being acted upon in the sense of the word. And false consciousness, according to Engels, would be anything that stops you from having that agency collectively. Now, there's going to be two objections to this, and one of which I hold to, about why I personally don't throw the word false consciousness around, because it sounds like a conspiracy theory, like there's some group of bourgeoisie who are keeping you from developing your consciousness as an active thing, either through an active cultural program or through active suppression. And I don't see a lot of evidence for that. You see evidence for that sporadically, but not in this totalizing way that would explain that why, the working class doesn't, become the class for itself. The other kind of more philosophical objection to it is collective agents only ever have imagined agency. Only individual agents have agency. And this is where the distinction between collective and aggregate becomes important again. Could there be a way to aggregate the agency of the entire class into something that can represent itself as opposed to just impose a collective vision on it? Could that be through, as historically in Bolshevism and other forms of Marxism, through the party, or through some kind of cybernetic imperative, or through, as the Paracon theses come up with, confederated circular councils which represent the wheel? There's a bunch of ways that it could happen. And the thing is, though, is that so far, it really kind of hasn't happened. So we're left wondering, what would enable the class to act for itself? And why it might act for itself in a country or a region, what would cause it to act for itself across the globe? That's a question that Marxists have tasked themselves to answer. And I'm not going to answer in this video today. This video is already too long. But if you don't deal with that question, the fundamental lesson of the 20th century is that Marxists have been struggling to reconceptualize how to deal with that question. And that's where I'm going to leave us off with today. So we don't have so much to break with the hammer this time is things to parse out and understand their context for. And I know this is a little bit more, old European philosophy dudes than you would probably normally like, but you do have to understand the context for which these particular phrasings and historical traditions manifested when they met in the socialist movement, and why people use the ways that they talk that they do. And I hope this series on class has helped you clarify some of your own thoughts about the way we talk about class in radical circles. All right. Like and subscribe here at Zero Books. You can find me generally on Monday on Theorizing with a Hammer bi-monthly, so twice a month. Or bi-weekly. I get those two confused. But twice a month here at Zero Books. You can also find Pop the Left, which currently has a surrogate me, P.H. Higgins, but I will be returning in the month of April in the year of 2021 soon. If you'd like to follow me on Twitter, I am at skeppoet, SKEPOET, and you can find me at Varn Vlog on YouTube, at the Emancipation Network podcast, often on the From Alpha to America Mega reading series, and Mortal Science, my other podcast with Esri of the Emancipation Network. You can also find me at the Former People journal, which is findable on WordPress and may or may not have a podcast coming soon. All right, that's all the plugs. That's the basics of class in itself and forest class, and why we have historically used the phrase class consciousness and false consciousness. And I hope you keep on smashing those idols in your head.
Thanks for watching this Zero Books video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to this channel and click on the notifications bell so that you'll be alerted whenever we release a new video. You should also consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons get access to our Inside Zero Books podcast every week and can get access to the Zero Books Book Club and help us to continue making online content from the left.